The man who chose love over judgment. The rhythmic sound of a hammer striking wood echoed through the small workshop, blending with the scent of fresh sawdust. The man behind the workbench, Samuel Carter, had spent decades mastering the art of carpentry. At 45 years old, his rugged hands bore the scars of his trade, each mark telling a story of perseverance and resilience. His brown eyes, once full of youthful ambition, now carried a quiet depth, a reflection of the battles he had fought, not just in life, but within his own heart. Samuel had never imagined he would be here, alone in a home built for a family that never came to be. His late wife, Angela, had dreamt of a house filled with laughter, the pitter-patter of small feet running across the wooden floors he had crafted with love. But fate had other plans. Angela's unexpected passing 5 years ago had shattered him, leaving him in a hollow existence. For a while, he found solace in his work, throwing himself into projects that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. But the silence of his home was unbearable. No amount of chiseling, sawing, or polishing could fill the void. Then, one fateful afternoon, an encounter at the town's community center planted a seed that would change the course of his life. A chance meeting. Samuel had been volunteering at the center for years, fixing broken furniture, building shelves, and lending a hand wherever needed. It was an unspoken agreement between him and the town. He gave his skills, and in return, he got a distraction from his loneliness. That day, while repairing a rickety bookcase in the children's reading area, he overheard a conversation between two women in the hallway. "It's such a shame," one of them whispered. "The Mitchell sisters have nowhere to go now. First, their parents, and now the foster home. Those poor girls. I heard they might have to separate them." The other replied in a hushed, sorrowful tone, "It's heartbreaking. They've already lost so much." Samuel paused mid-sandpaper stroke, his grip tightening around the wood. He wasn't one for eavesdropping, but something about the conversation caught his attention. 3 sisters, alone, in danger of being separated. He didn't need more details. The idea of 3 little girls, already robbed of their childhood innocence, being torn apart was too much to bear. Without thinking, he stepped out into the hallway. "Excuse me," he said, his deep voice tinged with an emotion he couldn't quite place. The 2 women turned, startled. He recognized one as Mrs. Taylor, the social worker who often worked with troubled families. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, adjusting the files in her arms. "Did you need something?" Samuel hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "These girls, the Mitchell sisters, are they still looking for a home?" Mrs. Taylor's eyes widened in surprise, then softened. "Yes," she admitted, "but they need stability. A permanent family, if possible." Samuel's heart pounded. He had no experience raising children. He was just a man with a quiet home and a past full of regrets. But something in his soul told him that this was his chance, his purpose. "I'd like to meet them," he said. The laughter that broke the silence. 2 days later, Samuel stood in the community center's playroom, waiting. His palms were slightly sweaty, an unfamiliar nervousness creeping over him. Then, the door opened, and 3 little girls stepped inside. The oldest, around 10, held her chin high, her dark brown eyes scanning him with a mix of curiosity and caution. The middle child, about 8, clung to her sister's arm, her smaller frame half hidden behind the older girl. And the youngest, no older than 5, had a mop of tight curls framing her round face, her wide eyes darting around the room. "Girls," Mrs. Taylor said gently, "this is Mr. Carter. He wanted to meet you." The eldest spoke first. "Why?" Her tone wasn't rude, just guarded. Samuel knelt to their level. "Because I heard you're looking for a home," he said honestly. "And I have one. I thought maybe we could see if it feels right." The 3 sisters exchanged glances, silent messages passing between them. "Are you like the other people?" the youngest one asked, tilting her head. Samuel frowned. "What do you mean?" The middle child spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "People look at us and see trouble." Samuel's chest tightened. He understood now. These girls, 3 black sisters in a predominantly white town, had already faced judgment and rejection. He smiled gently. "I don't see trouble," he said. "I see 3 strong girls who deserve a home where they're loved. That's all." For the first time, the oldest girl's expression softened. The youngest grinned. "You got snacks?" she asked. Samuel chuckled. "Plenty." That was the moment the walls began to crack. Over the next hour, they played a board game together, and soon, the hesitant glances turned into laughter. Samuel listened to their stories, their favorite cartoons, their silly jokes. By the time they left, the youngest had grabbed his hand without hesitation. As he watched them go, something inside him shifted. The house that had once felt like a tomb could become something new. A home. A place filled with warmth. And for the first time in years, Samuel Carter felt the stirrings of hope. The town's whispered doubts. Not everyone shared his optimism. The news of Samuel's decision spread like wildfire through the town. In coffee shops, grocery store aisles, and church pews, people talked. "He's a bachelor," one woman scoffed. "What does he know about raising 3 kids? And black kids, at that," another murmured. "How's he going to teach them about their culture, their history? He's setting himself up for failure." The murmurs followed him everywhere, but Samuel didn't care. His mind was made up. A week later, he filed the official adoption papers. A new beginning. When the day finally arrived for the girls to move in, Samuel found himself pacing his living room, arranging and rearranging the pillows on the couch. It had been years since his home felt like more than just a quiet place to sleep. Then, the knock came. He opened the door to find Mrs. Taylor standing with the 3 sisters, each clutching a small bag of belongings. The youngest wasted no time. "I call dibs on the biggest room," she declared, rushing inside. The middle sister hesitated before stepping over the threshold, glancing around with wide eyes. The oldest, still cautious, looked Samuel in the eyes. "Are you sure about this?" Samuel nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The girl studied him for a moment before nodding back. "Okay." As the door closed behind them, the empty house filled with the sound of giggles, footsteps, and life. Samuel stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed but certain. This was just the beginning. And he was ready. The storm before the calm. The first night in the Carter household was anything but peaceful. Samuel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds that now filled his once quiet home. The faint rustle of sheets as the girls shifted in their beds, the soft creak of a door opening and closing, the muffled sniffles from the room down the hall. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He had read the pamphlets, attended the social workers' meetings, and even spent hours watching online videos about parenting adopted children, especially children who had experienced trauma. But no amount of preparation could fully equip him for the reality of stepping into the role of a father overnight. A small knock at his bedroom door startled him. Samuel sat up. "Come in." The door creaked open, and in the dim glow of the hallway light, he saw the silhouette of the youngest sister, Mia, standing there clutching her stuffed rabbit. Samuel swung his legs over the side of the bed. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Mia hesitated, then shuffled inside, dragging her rabbit by its ear. "It's too quiet," she whispered. Samuel chuckled softly. "Too quiet? You sure about that?" He had spent the last few hours listening to drawers opening, beds creaking, and the hushed giggles of sisters trying to adjust to their new home. Mia nodded and clambered onto the edge of his bed, her little legs dangling off the side. At the foster house, there were lots of kids. We could hear them talking and moving around all the time. It made it less scary. Samuel's heart ached. This wasn't just a new home for Mia and her sisters. It was a completely different world. He leaned forward. "Want me to leave your door open? That way, you can hear me if you need me." Mia considered this, then nodded solemnly. Okay. As he walked her back to her room, Samuel noticed the middle sister, Ava, peeking out from her blankets. Everything okay? He asked gently. Ava hesitated before whispering. Mia always gets scared at night. Samuel smiled. Well, I'll be right down the hall if either of you need me. Mia climbed into bed, hugging her rabbit tightly. Good night, Mr. Carter. Samuel paused, his chest tightening at the title. You can just call me Samuel. Mia blinked sleepily at him. Maybe. Samuel chuckled, stepping out of the room. Good night, girls. He left the door slightly ajar, making sure they had the comfort of his presence nearby. As he walked back to his own room, he felt the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. This was only the beginning. The town's judgment begins. Samuel had always been a well-respected man in town. As a carpenter, he had built half the furniture in people's homes, repaired porches, and even volunteered at the local church whenever something needed fixing. But the moment word got out that he had adopted 3 black girls, the atmosphere changed. The first signs were subtle. A couple of neighbors who once waved when he passed now gave tight-lipped nods instead. At the grocery store, he noticed a few sideways glances from women in the produce aisle. In the coffee shop, he overheard whispers. I just don't see how he can manage. 3 girls, and not even one of them is blood. I give it 6 months. Then, the more direct comments came. At the hardware store, Mr. Jenkins, a man Samuel had known for years, clapped him on the back and said, Didn't think you had a soft spot for charity cases, Sam. Samuel clenched his jaw but forced a smile. They're not charity cases, Jenkins. They're my daughters. Jenkins gave a dismissive chuckle. Right. If you say so. At the church, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had always greeted him warmly, now folded her arms and said, Are you sure you know what you're doing, Samuel? Raising black children is different, you know. Samuel felt his blood simmer but remained composed. Raising any child takes love, and I've got plenty of that to give. Even his own sister, Sarah, expressed concern when she visited one evening. They're beautiful girls, Sam, she said hesitantly, watching as Mia colored at the kitchen table. But do you really think you can raise them properly? You don't know what it's like to be a black girl growing up in this world. Samuel sighed. I don't, he admitted, but I'm going to learn. Sarah pursed her lips. It's not just about love, you know. They need someone who understands them, their culture, their experiences. Samuel nodded. Then I'll make sure they have that. I'll make sure they grow up knowing where they come from and that they belong. Sarah sighed, clearly unconvinced, but she didn't argue further. Small battles, big lessons. As the weeks passed, Samuel quickly realized that parenting wasn't just about providing a roof over their heads. It was about navigating a world that wasn't always kind. One morning, as he made breakfast, he heard a frustrated sigh from the bathroom. Phew, my hair won't do anything. Ava groaned. Samuel peeked in and saw Ava struggling with her curls, her brush stuck halfway through. He frowned. Want some help? Ava looked at him, skeptical. You know how to do my hair. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. Not yet, but I can learn. That night, after the girls were in bed, he spent hours watching YouTube tutorials on how to care for black hair. He ordered the right shampoos, leave-in conditioners, and satin pillowcases. The next morning, he carefully followed a video and helped Ava detangle her hair. Not bad, Mr. Carter, she said, inspecting his work. Maybe you're not totally hopeless. Samuel grinned. High praise coming from you. The victories were small but meaningful. Ava started to open up, showing him her favorite books. Mia began calling him Sam instead of Mr. Carter. And the eldest, Olivia, though still guarded, had started sitting with him in the evenings, watching him work on furniture and asking quiet questions about Angela. But there were setbacks, too. At school, Olivia came home one day looking unusually quiet. When Samuel asked what was wrong, she hesitated before saying, "A teacher told me I should be grateful that you saved us." Samuel's heart sank. "Sweetheart, you don't owe me gratitude. You didn't ask for this situation. You didn't need saving. We're a family because I chose you, and you chose to trust me." Olivia's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "Okay," she whispered. The words still hurt, though, and the town continued to watch. The inevitable confrontation. One afternoon, Samuel was working in his shop when the door swung open. He turned, expecting to see Olivia or Mia looking for him. Instead, it was Tom, an old friend from church. "Need to talk, Sam," Tom said, his face serious. Samuel wiped his hands on his apron. "What's on your mind?" Tom hesitated before blurting out, "People are talking. They don't think this is natural." Samuel's jaw tightened. "What exactly isn't natural, Tom?" "A man raising kids who need a home." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "They just don't think it's right. The girls, they..." Samuel cut him off. "The girls what? Deserve a home, a father, love?" Tom sighed. "Just be careful, Sam. This town, it might not be as accepting as you hope." Samuel stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Thanks for the warning, Tom. But I'm not going anywhere. And neither are my girls." Tom exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he left. Samuel stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. He knew what he was up against, but he also knew that no amount of judgment, whispers, or side-eyes would change his decision. He had chosen these girls, and he wasn't backing down. The fire that tested them. The air inside the Carter household felt thick with something unspoken. It had been nearly 3 months since Samuel had brought Olivia, Ava, and Mia home, yet some days it felt like they were still strangers, each carrying their own fears, scars, and doubts. Samuel had spent his life building things, houses, furniture, a reputation as a reliable man. But this, raising 3 young girls who had lost everything, this was the hardest thing he had ever done. Still, he refused to let the cracks show. Until the fire. The flames that brought fear. It happened on a cold autumn night. Samuel had fallen asleep on the couch after another long day of balancing work and fatherhood. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Then, beep, beep, beep. The smoke alarm jolted him awake. Samuel sprang to his feet, heart pounding. A flicker of orange light danced at the base of the kitchen door. The acrid scent of burning wood filled his nostrils. A fire. His first thought wasn't for the house or his belongings. It was for the girls. Racing down the hallway, he threw open Olivia and Ava's door. "Get up," he shouted. "Fire." Ava bolted upright, eyes wide with panic. Olivia, always the protector, grabbed her sister's arm. Without hesitation, Samuel sprinted to Mia's room. She was curled up under the blankets, trembling. "Come on, sweetheart. I've got you," he said, scooping her into his arms. The fire was growing. Smoke curled into the hallway, thick and suffocating. Samuel wrapped one arm around Mia and took Ava's hand while Olivia ran ahead, clearing the way. They made it outside just as flames licked the edges of the kitchen windows. The fire spread rapidly, consuming the walls Samuel had once built with his own hands. Neighbors rushed out in their pajamas, watching in horror as the Carter home burned. Samuel held Mia close as she sobbed into his chest. Ava clung to his sleeve, and Olivia stood stiffly beside him, fists clenched. The fire department arrived minutes later, but it felt like an eternity. The flames hissed as the water hit them, the heat warping the cool night air. By the time the fire was out, half the house was gone. Everything they had built together, charred. Nowhere to turn. Samuel stood in the wreckage the next morning, feeling utterly defeated. The fire department had determined that faulty wiring in the kitchen was to blame. The insurance would cover the damages, but it would take months before they could rebuild. In the meantime, they had nowhere to live. "Maybe we should go back to the shelter," Olivia said quietly, avoiding his gaze. Samuel's chest tightened. "No, you belong with me." Olivia hesitated before replying. "We don't want to be a burden." Samuel knelt before her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "You are not a burden. This is your home, fire or no fire." But where would they go? It didn't take long for the answer to come. That evening, Pastor Reynolds knocked on the door of Samuel's burned-out home. "You and the girls can stay at the church for as long as you need," the pastor offered. "We'll figure this out together." Samuel had never been the kind of man to accept charity, but this wasn't about him anymore. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. So that night, he and the girls moved into the small guest quarters of the church, a space meant for traveling missionaries. It was cramped, but warm, safe. For now, that was enough. A town divided. The fire became the talk of the town. And with it, the whispers grew louder. "They say it's a sign," one woman muttered at the grocery store. "A single man raising 3 black girls. It was never going to work," another agreed. Samuel ignored them, but Olivia, Ava, and Mia weren't deaf. They heard every word, and it started to wear on them. The final straw came 2 weeks later. At school, Olivia was called to the principal's office after an incident in the cafeteria. "What happened?" Samuel asked when he arrived at the school. The principal, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, sighed. "Olivia punched another student." Samuel turned to Olivia, stunned. "Is that true?" Olivia looked away, her jaw clenched. She was provoked, the principal added quickly. "A boy called her a..." She hesitated. "A what?" Samuel pressed. The principal exhaled. "He called her a charity case and said you only adopted her for attention." Samuel felt something hot and sharp in his chest. And what happened next? The principal glanced at Olivia. She defended herself. "She'll be suspended for 3 days." Samuel didn't argue. He simply nodded and walked Olivia to the truck. They sat in silence for a long time before Olivia finally whispered, "I'm sorry." Samuel started the engine but didn't move. "You don't have to apologize for standing up for yourself." "I don't belong here," Olivia murmured. Samuel turned to her, his heart aching. "You belong wherever you choose to be. And as long as you want, that place is with me." She swallowed hard but said nothing. The fire hadn't just burned their house, it had burned something inside Olivia too. And Samuel wasn't sure how to fix it. Standing his ground. The following Sunday, Samuel sat through church service, his mind heavy with doubt. When it ended, he stood up and cleared his throat. "May I say something?" The congregation turned. Pastor Reynolds nodded. "Of course." Samuel stepped forward, his voice steady. 3 months ago, I became a father. And in that time, I've heard every whisper, every doubt, every judgment this town has thrown at me." He met their eyes, unwavering. "I didn't adopt Olivia, Ava, and Mia to save them. I adopted them because they saved me from a life of emptiness." A murmur swept through the crowd. "I don't need your approval," he continued, "but I will not stand by and let my daughters be treated like outsiders in their own home. This town is their home now, whether you like it or not." Silence. Then, from the back, an older woman stood up. Mrs. Thompson, the same woman who had once questioned his ability to raise black children. She cleared her throat. "I was wrong about you, Samuel." Another voice chimed in. "I was wrong too." One by one, people in the church murmured agreement. Not all of them. Not most. But enough. Samuel exhaled, his grip loosening. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start. A home worth fighting for. That night, as Samuel tucked the girls into their makeshift beds at the church, Olivia looked up at him. You really don't care what people think. Samuel smiled, brushing a stray curl from her face. I care about what you think. She bit her lip. I think I want to stay. Samuel's heart swelled. You always have a choice, Olivia, he said softly. But I'll always fight for you. As he left the room, he heard Mia whisper, "Good night, Daddy." Samuel froze. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. Maybe this wasn't easy. Maybe the town would never fully accept them. But this was home. And it was worth fighting for. When love is tested, the first cold wind of winter swept through the small town, rustling the remaining leaves on the trees and sending a chill through the streets. The Carter household, or what was left of it, still stood in ruin, the blackened remains of the kitchen and parts of the living room like a scar on the landscape. Samuel had begun the slow process of rebuilding, determined to restore the house that had once symbolized hope. But the true challenge wasn't fixing broken walls. It was mending the wounds left behind in the hearts of his daughters. The fire had shaken them, not just because they lost their home, but because it reminded them of how fragile their place in this world was. And the town wasn't about to let them forget it. The winter of loneliness. Living in the church's guest quarters had been a blessing, but it wasn't home. The space was too small for a growing family, and the girls were struggling. Ava, once full of curiosity, barely spoke. Mia, who had clung to Samuel in the early days, now grew distant. Olivia, always the strongest, had become angrier, her patience wearing thin with every whisper, every judgmental stare. Then came the invitations, or rather, the lack of them. As the holidays approached, Christmas decorations began to light up the neighborhood. Families made plans for dinners and gatherings. But the Carters, they were excluded. Not one invitation arrived for Olivia, Ava, or Mia to attend a sleepover, a birthday party, or even a school event. And Samuel noticed. One evening, he walked into the church guest room and saw Olivia sitting at the window, staring outside. She was watching the Johnsons, the family that lived across from where their home had been. Inside their warm, glowing house, children laughed around a decorated Christmas tree. They didn't invite you, Samuel asked gently. Olivia's lips pressed into a tight line. They never do. Samuel exhaled, anger simmering just beneath his skin. He wanted to storm across the street and demand to know why. But he already knew. Instead, he sat beside her. It's their loss, you know. Olivia scoffed. Doesn't feel like it. We'll make our own traditions, he promised. We don't need their approval to have a good Christmas. Olivia didn't respond. Samuel knew words weren't enough. He had to show them. A Christmas of their own. Samuel got to work. He found an old artificial Christmas tree in the church's storage room and set it up in their small guest space. He bought decorations, not fancy ones, but colorful and fun. And then, on Christmas Eve, he surprised the girls. Ava woke first, rubbing her eyes as she stepped into the main room. Her jaw dropped when she saw it. Lights twinkling, stockings hung on the walls, and a small pile of presents wrapped under the tree. Wait, what? She whispered. Samuel stood nearby, grinning. Merry Christmas, kiddo. Mia and Olivia soon joined, their eyes widening. You did this? Mia asked in disbelief. Of course, Samuel said. Did you think I'd let you go without Christmas? The girls exchanged looks, something unreadable passing between them. Then, for the first time in weeks, Olivia smiled. A town's cold shoulder. The warmth of their Christmas was short-lived. When school resumed, the weight of being outsiders hit harder than ever. One afternoon, Samuel arrived early for pickup. He leaned against his truck, watching the school doors open as kids spilled out, laughing and chatting in groups. Then he saw Olivia walking alone. Not just alone. Isolated. No one talked to her. No one walked beside her. His gut twisted. Ava and Mia followed, their steps equally slow. Samuel could see it. The loneliness, the rejection. He clenched his fists. Something had to change. The meeting that changed everything. That evening, Samuel made a decision. It was time to confront the school board. Walking into the district office, he felt the weight of every whispered comment, every judgmental glance. But he didn't care. He found himself sitting in a meeting room with Principal Hawkins and 2 other board members, their faces unreadable. "I want to talk about my daughters," Samuel began, his voice calm but firm. Principal Hawkins nodded slowly. "Is there a problem?" Samuel leaned forward. "You tell me. Because from where I stand, my girls have been treated like outsiders since the day they walked into this town." One of the board members cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, that's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," Samuel cut in. "It's a fact. Olivia gets ignored in class. Ava has no friends, and Mia spends her lunch alone. I see it. They feel it. And no one's doing anything about it." Principal Hawkins sighed. "Samuel, I understand your concerns, but—" "No, you don't understand," Samuel interrupted. "Because if you did, you'd see how much damage this is doing to them. You'd see that this school, this town, is failing them. And I won't let it continue." The room fell into silence. Finally, the principal nodded. "We'll look into it." Samuel knew better than to believe empty promises. But he had planted a seed. And sometimes, that was enough. The first shift. A week after the meeting, something changed. It was small at first. A teacher called on Olivia in class. A girl sat next to Ava at lunch. Mia got invited to a birthday party. Samuel noticed. And so did the girls. One evening, Olivia hesitated before speaking. Did you do something?" Samuel shrugged. "Just had a conversation." Olivia stared at him. Then, for the first time in months, she whispered, "Thanks." Samuel smiled. They weren't there yet. But step by step, they were getting closer. The threat that almost broke them. But change never comes without resistance. One evening, Samuel was locking up his workshop when he noticed something strange. A note. Taped to the door. His stomach dropped as he read the words scrawled in sharp, angry handwriting. "Go back to where you belong." Samuel exhaled sharply. He glanced around, but the street was empty. His blood boiled, but fear coiled in his gut. Not for himself, for his daughters. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had fought so hard to give the girls a home, to protect them. But would it ever be enough? As the town's judgment loomed like a storm cloud, Samuel knew one thing for certain. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. When hate knocks at the door. The letter sat on Samuel's workbench, the words scrawled in dark ink staring back at him like an open wound. Go back to where you belong. He had read it a dozen times, his fingers tightening around the edges of the paper each time. The words weren't just meant for him. They were meant for Olivia, Ava, and Mia. And that made his blood boil. Samuel had spent his life building things, but nothing, no piece of furniture, no home, no work of art, had ever mattered as much as these girls. He had fought for them, loved them, protected them, and now someone wanted to drive them away. Not on his watch. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't let anger cloud his judgment. This wasn't about him. This was about them. And he needed to make sure they never saw this letter. He folded it carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket. Then he grabbed his toolbox and headed toward the church, where the girls were waiting for dinner. The shadows that linger. Samuel tried to act normal that night, but Olivia was too sharp to miss the tension in his face. "You okay?" she asked, picking at her dinner. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about the house repairs." She didn't believe him. He could see it in the way her brow furrowed. "People are still talking about us, aren't they?" Samuel sighed, setting his fork down. He wasn't going to lie to her. "Some are," he admitted, "but we don't let them decide who we are. do we?" Olivia nodded slowly, but the worry didn't leave her face. A breaking point at school. The next day at school, the tension finally snapped. Mia came running to the truck after dismissal, her eyes filled with tears. "A boy pushed me," she sniffled, wiping her face. Samuel's jaw clenched. "Who?" "I don't know his name," she mumbled. He said I don't belong here." Samuel felt white-hot anger surge through him. Ava slid into the truck beside Mia, her face stormy. "And the teacher didn't even say anything, Dad. She just told Mia to walk away." Samuel gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. That was it. It was time to make a stand. Confronting the school board. Again. Samuel didn't wait. The next morning, he walked straight into Principal Hawkins' office, his face unreadable but his anger barely contained. "This needs to stop," he said, voice low and firm. The principal shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Carter, I understand your concern, but—" "No," Samuel cut him off. "You don't understand. You don't understand what it's like for my girls to walk into this school and be treated like outsiders. You don't understand what it's like to be a father and know your kids are being bullied for something as simple as who they are." The principal hesitated. Samuel continued, his voice unwavering. "I don't expect overnight change, but I expect better than this." The principal exhaled. "I'll talk to the staff and the students." Samuel nodded. It wasn't a victory, but it was something. An unexpected ally. That afternoon, as Samuel left the school, he heard footsteps behind him. "Mr. Carter." He turned to see a woman. Mrs. Reynolds, a teacher he recognized but had never spoken to. She looked at him with a mix of guilt and determination. "I just wanted to say, I see what's happening," she admitted, "and I want to help." Samuel studied her. "Why now?" She sighed. "Because it's wrong, and I should have spoken up sooner." For the first time in weeks, Samuel felt a flicker of hope. A line in the sand. That evening, Olivia found him in his workshop, her arms crossed. "I heard what happened at school." Samuel kept sanding the wooden table in front of him. "Yeah. You really told off the principal." Samuel smirked. "I had a conversation." Olivia shook her head, smiling for the first time in days. "You really don't care what people think, do you?" Samuel set down the sandpaper and met her gaze. "I care what you think," he said. She was silent for a long time. Then she whispered, "Thanks for fighting for us." Samuel felt something settle in his chest. Always. The warning that changed everything. Just as things started to feel lighter, the shadows returned. That night, someone slashed the tires of Samuel's truck. He found them the next morning, completely destroyed. No note this time. No explanation. Just an act of hate. He stood there, staring at the damage, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He had expected pushback. But this was different. This was personal. And it was a warning. Someone wanted him to back down. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. The stand that changed everything. The cold morning air bit at Samuel's skin as he stood beside his truck, staring at the slashed tires. The deep gashes in the rubber were fresh, malicious, deliberate. This wasn't a prank. This was a message. A message from cowards. Ava, Mia, and Olivia weren't awake yet, but when they saw this, they would know. They would see the evidence of a town that still didn't want them. A town that whispered behind their backs and now had taken their hate beyond words. Samuel's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists at his sides. No, not today. Not ever. He had spent his life building homes, fixing what was broken. He had lost his wife, his sense of purpose, and for a long time, the dream of a family. But these girls, they were his family now. And he would never, back down. Not for himself. Not for them. Not for anyone. The fear in their eyes. By the time the girls woke up, Samuel had already spoken to the police. Not that it did much good. The officer took one look at the damage inside. No cameras in the church parking lot, he muttered, shaking his head. Could have been anyone. Samuel had clenched his jaw. You and I both know that's not true. The officer sighed again, his expression unreadable. If you get any more trouble, let us know. That was it. No real investigation. No action. Just a hollow promise. When the girls came outside and saw the truck, their reactions were instant. Mia grabbed Samuel's hand, her small fingers trembling. Was it because of us? She whispered. Ava looked between the tires and her father's face, her lip curling in anger. Cowards, she muttered under her breath. They won't even say it to our faces. But it was Olivia's silence that struck Samuel the most. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She just stared at the damage for a long time, her face cold, unreadable. Then she turned and walked back into the church. Samuel let out a slow breath. He didn't stop her. This wasn't just about a truck. This was about the world they lived in. A world that had told these girls, time and time again, that they didn't belong. But they did, and Samuel was going to make damned sure they knew it. A challenge to the town. That evening, Samuel didn't stay quiet. At the town hall meeting, a monthly gathering where the town's issues were discussed, he stood up. He didn't ask for permission to speak. He simply walked to the front of the room, turned to face the crowd, and said, "My truck was vandalized last night." Murmurs rippled through the audience. "I've lived here my whole life," he continued, his voice calm but firm. "Built homes for half the families in this room. Fixed your doors, your porches, your broken fences." People avoided his gaze. But 3 months ago, I became a father, and everything changed. Silence. "I didn't expect a parade," Samuel said. "I didn't expect everyone to agree with my decision. But I expected better than this." He gestured toward the door, where the wrecked truck sat outside. Some people shifted in their seats. Others frowned. "The girls I adopted, they're your neighbors, your children's classmates. And yet, since they arrived, you've whispered about them, excluded them, judged them. And now someone has decided to send a message." Samuel's voice never wavered. "Let me be clear. I'm not leaving. My daughters are not leaving." More murmurs. A few uncomfortable looks. "And if there's anyone in this town who has a problem with that, you can say it to my face." Samuel crossed his arms, scanning the room. "But don't think for a second that I'll back down." No one spoke. No one dared speak. After a long moment, he turned and walked out. A town's reckoning. The next morning, something unexpected happened. First, it was a knock on the church door. Samuel opened it to find Mrs. Reynolds, the teacher who had quietly supported the girls from the beginning. "I heard what you said last night," she said softly. "And I wanted you to know you're not alone." Samuel studied her. "Am I not?" She nodded firmly. "You have more supporters than you think. People have just been afraid to speak up." Samuel exhaled. "I don't need people to speak up. I need them to act." Mrs. Reynolds hesitated, then nodded again. "Then let me start." The next day, at school, Olivia walked into the cafeteria expecting the usual, a table to herself, whispers behind her back, cold glances from kids who didn't know her but had already decided she didn't belong. Instead, something different happened. Sarah Bennett, one of the most popular girls in school, walked over, tray in hand. "Can I sit here?" she asked. Olivia stared at her. "What?" Sarah hesitated. I wanted to say that what happened to your dad's truck, that was messed up. And I'm sorry." Olivia didn't know what to say. Ava, sitting beside her, narrowed her eyes. "Why now?" Sarah flushed. "Because I was scared. And that's not a good enough excuse." Ava studied her, then shrugged. "Fine. Sit." Sarah sat. The whispers didn't stop. But they changed. That night, As Olivia told Samuel about what happened, she looked almost uncertain. "Do you think she actually means it?" she asked. Samuel thought for a long moment. "People don't always get it right the first time," he said. "But if they're willing to try, that's worth something." The final stand. Weeks passed. The house repairs continued. The truck was fixed. The town's hostility didn't disappear overnight, but something had shifted. One by one, people began reaching out. A neighbor who had once ignored them brought over fresh bread. A shop owner gave Ava a free book when she stopped in after school. One of Mia's teachers asked Samuel for advice on how to better support students of color. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Then, one cold evening, as Samuel finished sanding down the new kitchen cabinets, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Olivia standing there, arms crossed. She studied him for a long moment. Then she exhaled sharply. "Dad," she said. Samuel froze. She had never called him that before. His throat tightened. "Yeah." She hesitated, then smirked. "You're doing okay, I guess." Samuel chuckled, blinking back the sting in his eyes. "I'll take it. A home rebuilt, a family unbreakable." By spring, the house was finished. On the first night back, Samuel tucked the girls in, Olivia in her own room, Ava and Mia still sharing. As he turned to leave, Mia grabbed his hand. "Dad," she whispered. Samuel smiled. "Yeah, sweetheart. We're home, right?" He squeezed her hand. "Yeah, we are." And this time, no one, not the town, not the whispers, not the hate, could take that away from them. Because they weren't just a man and 3 adopted girls anymore. They were a family. And family always stands together. A family forged in fire. The first night back in their rebuilt home, the house felt different. Not just because of the fresh paint or the new wooden beams that Samuel had worked tirelessly to install, but because something deeper had changed. The weight of the past, of being outsiders, of whispered judgments, of vandalized trucks and hateful stares, was still there, but now it no longer defined them. They had survived. They had fought. And they had won. Samuel stood in the doorway of the girls' rooms, watching as they settled in. Mia, curled up in her new bed, clutched her stuffed rabbit, a little worn but still well-loved. Ava, sitting cross-legged with a book in her lap, looked at peace for the first time in a long while. Olivia, the last to settle, sat on the edge of her bed, running her fingers over the new wooden nightstand Samuel had made for her. "Dad?" Samuel blinked. She had only called him that once before. "Yeah." "Liv?" She hesitated before meeting his gaze. "Thanks for not giving up on us." Samuel's throat tightened. He had been called a lot of things in his life. Stubborn, hard-headed, even reckless. But as he looked at the 3 girls in front of him, there was only one title that truly mattered to him now. "Never," he said softly. "I'll never give up on you." A town's changing heart. The first real test of change came 2 weeks later. Samuel was at the hardware store, picking up supplies for a new porch swing the girls had requested, when he ran into Tom, the same man who had once told him the town might not accept his family. Tom hesitated before speaking. "Heard about what happened at the school?" Samuel nodded, his grip tightening on the cart. "Yeah." Tom sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You were right. This town hasn't been fair to you. To them." Samuel didn't respond. He just waited. "I guess I just wanted to say," Tom continued, shifting awkwardly, "that it takes a real man to stand by his kids, no matter what." Samuel studied him for a long moment. It wasn't a full apology, but it was something. So he simply nodded. "That's what being a father is." Tom exhaled and gave a small, uncertain nod before walking away. The old Samuel might have let resentment linger, might have held on to the past. But now he had a future to focus on, a family that stood together. Spring turned to summer, and with it, the final remnants of the storm they had weathered began to fade. Mia was thriving in school. Her teachers praised her kindness, her ability to bring people together. Ava had found her own strength, no longer hiding behind Olivia's protection, but carving her own space in the world. And Olivia, she still had her fire, but now it burned with purpose. One afternoon, Samuel found her in the garage, working on a piece of wood with a chisel. "What's this?" he asked, leaning over. She hesitated, then held up the carved plaque. It read, "Carter Family, established year of unbreakable love." Samuel swallowed hard. "Figured we should make it official," Olivia said, glancing at him. "If that's okay." Samuel took a slow breath, nodding. "Yeah, Liv, that's more than okay." Together, they nailed the plaque onto the front porch. And just like that, the Carter family had more than a house. They had a home, one they had fought for, one they had earned, one that no whisper, no stare, no act of hatred could ever take away from them. Because family isn't just about blood. It's about standing together, no matter what.